at this point, it should be clear to everyone that the European exploration of the New World is inextricably linked to imperialism. That is to say, the acquisition of colonies abroad. And imperialism, again, is, the acquisition of land and the natural resource often that are found in that new territory abroad. And, you're coming in there uninvited and you just claim it as your own. So what's happening here is, aside from overseas imperialism, is that you have a number of European powers. In fact, we discussed the Spanish Empire. Now we're discussing the English. Certainly there was the Portuguese, the French, the Dutch, right? And all these European powers were in constant competition with each other. They were trying to gain the most overseas territory as they can. They wanted to outdo their rivals, their other European empires. In fact, they're constantly at war with each other, especially England and France, as we'll discuss. So at stake here is imperial greatness, right? The greatness of your empire, whatever empire that may be. At stake was this greatness and the power, right? The status you have on the global stage. So again, there's this link with national glory and territorial acquisition. The bigger your empire was, the greater your country was. However, the acquisition of colonies abroad also played a role, not just in national greatness, but also it played a role in economics and economic greatness as well. That is, the colonies abroad were now seen as crucial to your empire's economic self-sufficiency, as stated here. So this dovetails with an economic theory that emerged during this age of European imperialism, and that's called mercantilism. And it reflects this transition we've been talking about, going away from feudalism towards that of more modern capitalism. Though it must be emphasized that mercantilism is a very early economic theory in the early history of capitalism. And it's going to be displaced by the late 18th century. So how does mercantilism work? Well, it argues that self-sufficiency was the key to your nation's wealth. Self-sufficiency. So when you think about that term, it means that you want to be independent, economically speaking. You don't want to be in a relation of dependency with other countries. Okay, so how do you ensure that in your your economic relations with other countries? Well, in order to ensure your self-sufficiency, it's argued that you must maintain what is called a positive trade balance. And basically this means that there should be a balance between your country's imports and exports. It cannot be lopsided one way or the other. So you can't have, too many imports and not enough exports, and the other way around. One should not exceed the other drastically. You must try to maintain a relative balance of imports and exports. So that's what we mean by positive trade balance. So hopefully you can figure out why this was deemed to guarantee, or to at least to maximize your self-sufficiency, right, as a country. Well, here's how it works. Once you become too dependent upon another country for a particular, commodity or various commodities, well, that leads to imbalance, right? You become dependent on that country for, I don't know, let's say wool or textiles or grain. And similarly, if you export to other countries, you become dependent, your economy becomes dependent on those receiving your country's exports. Okay, so you depend on it for your, your wealth as a country. So again, to avoid that relation of dependency, you should strive to obtain a positive trade balance. Okay. Well, you have to wonder, if this is true, how does one acquire resources that are scarce in your own country? And equally, where should one sell your surplus products, right, that you produce in your own economy, in order to avoid overproduction, right? Because you don't want overproduction whereby you produce too much and you can't sell it. Well, it should be obvious to you that overseas colonies solves that problem. Okay? Overseas colonies exist to serve the interest of the home country, or as they call it, the mother country. The overseas colonies supply the mother country with raw materials and resources, yet at the same time, the colonies served as a market for the mother country's, manufactured goods and products. So imagine England and, let's say, the North American colonies. And this will be especially true when we talk about the American Revolution, and the whole idea of boycotting, British goods, right? Think about that trade that's going back and forth with England and, let's say, Massachusetts. Well, you have this trade routes established, right? And from the English point of view, the colonies served as not only a source of goods, right? Because they're English colonies, they don't have to depend on the French Empire for trade, or, the Spanish. No, they could just gain it from their overseas colonies. At the same time, once you have a critical mass of English population in the New World, and let's say by 1776, these are the 13 colonies, well, they're a dependable market for English finished goods. So this is the trade relation that does not involve other European countries. Okay, so obviously abiding by that theory of mercantilism. So again, this is mercantilism as a theory, and my whole point here is to underscore the importance of colonies abroad. Of course, it applies to other empires, not just English, right? But here's a way to guarantee self-sufficiency, as I've emphasized. Now, eventually, mercantilism would be displaced by the opposite approach. That is, not by a closed system, as we could imagine with mercantilism, but rather open trade, or to use a more modern term, free trade, to not have barriers and boundaries. And this was argued by the famous philosopher Adam Smith in his famous book, Wealth of Nations, 1776. One of the most influential books in, modern history, I have to say, because we're living in a Smithian economic world still today. All right. So Adam Smith argued the opposite, that the key to a nation's wealth, right, as stated in the very title, is to abandon mercantilism in favor of open trade. And this indeed would happen. Now, while all the colonies were certainly important in some regard to early colonial history, in particular, however, it seems to me that Puritan New England seemed to wield a long-lasting influence even upon American life. And arguably, this is still true today. Hopefully, this will become apparent to you when we discuss here, as stated, the influence of Puritan New England. And we'll talk about various influences. And the first one will be a famous speech that the Puritan leader John Winthrop gave as the Puritans were landing upon Massachusetts. Okay, John Winthrop, and this is him right here. He's a prominent Puritan. In fact, he was elected governor of the Puritans once they established settlements here. And while still on board and about to disembark from the ship, he gave a famous sermon where he said, quote, "We must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us," unquote. And he borrowed this, the city upon a hill image, from a biblical reference to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And he's giving a sermon to Puritans about to settle. So what does he mean by this? He means that, well, the Puritans, and this is what they truly believed, the Puritans were practicing a pure form of Christianity. They were exceptional in the Christian world. And they, in fact, ventured across the Atlantic to form this, if you will, ideal community, ideal Christian community, where they could, practice this pure form of Christianity as they saw it, of course. So the city upon a hill is this notion that they are elevated, okay, like they're on a hill. They're elevated before all of Christendom, all the Christian world. In fact, he says, as I stated earlier, quote, "The eyes of all people are upon us." He means the eyes of Christianity, right? They are watching us because we are on the shining path, right, of perfect Christianity, right? And here we are about to establish this perfect Christian society in what they call, quote, New Jerusalem, all right? So this is obviously this notion that they were ordained by God to settle this, quote, vacant land, as they saw it, and to build a godly society and to be exemplary, that is, to set an example for the rest of the world. Now, today, this image still survives, okay? It survived through the centuries. His phrase, "a city upon a hill." You will hear this analogy that is connected to U.S. exceptionalism. You'll hear it in speeches still today. President Reagan gave a famous speech. President John F. Kennedy gave a famous speech. In fact, you could look it up on YouTube, City Upon a Hill speech. Obama used it as when he was a president in his speeches, all right? So again, it's a metaphor. City Upon a Hill is a metaphor for U.S. exceptionalism. And in this case, it's a moral claim, right, that the Puritans are establishing a city of God, if you will, upon what they perceived as this holy land.